My stepfather made me restart the dishes every night for 3 years, waiting until the last plate to tell me the water wasn't hot enough. When I finally asked if the water was hot enough for him, he smirked and said, "Now you're learning." I just kept washing. That was 9 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my dorm in tears. My stepfather Greg was a master at psychological warfare. He'd been married to my mom for 3 years, and in that time, he'd perfected the art of making me miserable while maintaining his image as the responsible parent who was just trying to teach me discipline. His favorite game started when I was 14. Every night after dinner, it was my job to wash the dishes. Greg would wait exactly 15 minutes after I started, then march into the kitchen with this theatrical concern on his face. He'd plunge his hand into the dishwater and gasp like he discovered something horrifying. "This water is ice cold. You trying to spread germs through this whole house? Empty it out and start over with proper hot water." It didn't matter if steam was literally rising from the sink. The water was always too cold, according to Greg. Sometimes he'd wait until I was on the last plate, watching TV from the living room until he heard me getting ready to drain the sink. Then he'd rush in for his performance. The worst part was the smirk. This little satisfied grin as he watched me dump everything out and start over, sometimes for the 3rd time in one night. Mom worked late shifts at the hospital, so she never saw it happen. When I tried telling her, Greg convinced her I was being dramatic about normal parenting. He even told her I was purposely using cold water to rush through my chores. She believed him because why wouldn't she? He was the adult. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in November. I'd already redone the dishes twice that night. My hands were raw from the hot water and harsh dish soap. I was almost done with round 3 when I heard his footsteps. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, already smirking before he'd even tested the water. That's when something in me snapped. He wanted hot water, I'd give him hot water. The next night, I prepared. I filled our largest stock pot with water and set it on the back burner at 5:45, knowing dinner would end around 6:30. By the time I started dishes, that water had been at a rolling boil for 45 minutes. I put on rubber gloves, telling myself they were for the harsh soap. I started washing, making sure to clank the plates loud enough for Greg to hear from his recliner. I kept checking the clock. 14 minutes, 15, 16. Then I heard it. The creak of his recliner footrest snapping shut, his heavy footsteps approaching. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. He walked in with that same superior expression, already rolling up his sleeve. "You know, one day you'll thank me for teaching you proper hygiene standards," he said, approaching the sink. I kept my eyes on the plate I was washing, not trusting myself to look at him. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. His hand went into the water with the same dramatic plunge he always did, meant to splash me a little and establish dominance. But this time, instead of his usual disappointed sigh, there was a sound I'd never heard him make before. A high-pitched yelp that turned into a roar. His hand came out so fast it sent water flying across the kitchen. His face went through about 6 different emotions in 2 seconds. Shock, pain, rage, then something I'd never seen before. Fear. He cradled his bright red hand against his chest, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. I kept washing dishes, calm as could be, and without looking up said, "Is the water hot enough for you?" For a moment, I thought he might actually hit me. His whole body tensed, his good hand clenched into a fist, but then he saw something in my eyes. Maybe it was the fact that I wasn't scared anymore. Maybe it was the realization that I'd finally fought back. Or maybe he just realized that explaining a burned hand to my mother would raise questions he didn't want to answer. He stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably 10 seconds. Then he turned and walked out without a word. No smirk, no lecture, nothing. That's when the biggest saga of my life began, because the next day I woke up to 16 missed calls from my mom and a text that said, "What did you do to Greg?" I stared at my phone screen in first period calculus while Mr. Peterson droned on about derivatives. More texts kept coming. "Greg is in the emergency room." Then, "His hand is severely burned." Then, "Come home now." My hand stayed steady. Even though my heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone would hear it, I knew this was it. The moment everything would change. I asked for a bathroom pass and walked straight to the parking lot instead. My hands shook as I dialed Mom's number. She picked up on the first ring and started screaming about how Greg said I deliberately burned him with boiling water and how he was talking about pressing charges for assault. I forced myself to sound confused instead of defensive, asking what she was talking about, saying I just did the dishes like always. The drive home took forever, even though I was going slow on purpose, practicing my story over and over. The rubber gloves were already gone with last night's trash pickup. The stock pot was clean and back in its normal spot. I knew it would be my word against his, and I'd been losing that battle for 3 years straight. Mom was pacing the kitchen when I walked in, still wearing her scrubs from her night shift. She pointed at the table where I'd been summoned so many times before. I sat down and watched her pace back and forth. She told me Greg was at the hospital getting treatment for second-degree burns, and the water was over 180 degrees, and I needed to explain that right now. I kept my voice calm and said, "I always use hot water because that's what he keeps telling me to do. That he's the one who always says it's never hot enough. That he stuck his hand in before I could warn him it was hotter than usual." I watched her face go through about 10 different emotions. Mom finally slumped into a chair across from me, and I could see how tired she was from her shift and now this whole mess. She said she didn't know what to believe anymore, and that Greg was talking about family counseling because he thinks I have anger issues. I saw the doubt in her eyes, but it wasn't doubt about Greg. It was doubt about whether she was a good mom. The front door opened, and Greg walked in with his hand wrapped in white gauze like a giant club. He didn't even look at me, just talked to Mom about how he didn't feel safe in his own home, and maybe I should go stay with my father for a while. My stomach dropped because I knew he was escalating this whole thing. I stood up fast and said, "My father lives in Colorado, and I have 6 months left of senior year, and they can't just send me away." Greg finally looked at me, and I saw something cold in his eyes, something calculating. This wasn't about his burned hand at all. This was about winning the war I'd started. I went to my room and texted Daniel that Greg was trying to get me sent to Colorado, and the hot water thing had backfired. He texted back immediately telling me to come over because his mom was making dinner, and she'd already set a place for me. I grabbed my backpack and left without asking permission. At Daniel's house, I finally let myself shake for real. Mrs. Smith didn't ask any questions, just put a bowl of chicken soup in front of me like she knew exactly what I needed. Daniel sat next to me, solid and steady like always, the only person who believed me about Greg from the very beginning. The next morning at school, I kept my head down and tried to focus on normal stuff, but in the hallway between second and third period, I caught Tyler watching me from his locker. Greg's son from his first marriage usually acted like I didn't exist, but today he kept staring, and when I looked right at him, he turned away fast and practically ran to his next class. At lunch, Daniel tried to get me to work on our calculus homework, but my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with texts from my mom about family meetings and new household rules, and how we needed to discuss boundaries. I turned my phone face down and pushed my food around my plate while Daniel kept shooting me worried looks. After school, I walked home slow as possible, and when I got there, I found a brand new silver padlock on the kitchen door with a keypad attached. Greg was sitting in the living room with my mom, and when he saw me looking at the lock, he stood up and explained it was for everyone's safety, while my mom just nodded and stared at her hands. I asked how I was supposed to make my lunch for tomorrow, and Greg pulled out a typed schedule from his pocket showing kitchen hours for me would be 6 to 7 in the morning and 4 to 5 in the afternoon with supervision required. My mom shifted in her seat but didn't say anything, and that's when I knew she she was choosing sides through her silence. That night, I sat at my desk and typed an email to my dad in Colorado, telling him things were bad with Greg, and Mom wanted to send me to live with him. 3 hours later, his response popped up saying he didn't have room in his apartment, and I needed to finish school where I was, and maybe try to work things out. I deleted the email and lay in bed, listening to every creak in the house, and wondering if it was Greg's footsteps coming down the hall. 3 days passed with the kitchen lock and the supervised meal times, and then Ms. Rodriguez called me into her office during study hall. She said my attendance was perfect and my grades were great, but I seemed distracted lately, and asked if everything was okay at home. I gave her some vague answer about family stress and college applications, while she watched me with this look like she knew I was holding back. She slid her business card across the desk and said her door was always open if I needed someone neutral to talk to. That night at dinner, Greg announced new rules where I had to document all my activities in a shared family calendar and text when I arrived, and left any location for coordination purposes. I wonder what Greg's real game is here with these extreme new rules and that kitchen lock. It feels like he's using his burned hand to grab way more control than just getting back at the narrator for the hot water thing. My mom called it structure when I pointed out this was basically house arrest. Greg's bandaged hand sat on the table like a trophy while he explained that violent behavior required careful management and they were just trying to help me. The next morning, at school, I was shoving books into my locker when someone cleared their throat behind me. I turned around to see this skinny freshman kid standing there, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he needed to use the bathroom. It was Tyler, Greg's son from his first marriage, who I'd seen maybe 5 times total since Greg married my mom. His eyes kept darting around the hallway like he was checking for escape routes. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally whispered that he needed to talk to me but not here, and asked if I could meet him in the library after school. Before I could even answer, he was already walking away, practically running down the hall. In calculus class, Daniel kept poking me with his pencil because I wasn't paying attention to the lesson about derivatives. I scribbled on his notebook that Tyler had approached me, that Greg's kid wanted to meet. Daniel wrote back that it could be a trap, that Greg might be using his son to get information about what I was planning. The rest of the day crawled by while I debated whether to show up or not. When the final bell rang, I headed to the library anyway, finding Tyler hunched over a table in the back corner behind the reference books where nobody ever went. He looked even more scared than he had that morning, his hands shaking as he pulled out a chair for me to sit. He kept his voice so quiet, I had to lean in to hear him say that Greg had done the same thing to him, the dishes and the rules and the locks on everything. He said that's why his mom divorced Greg, but nobody believed a 12-year-old kid over a respected adult. My whole body went cold as I realized what he was telling me. Then Tyler pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and started scrolling through his gallery. He turned the screen toward me and hit play on a video. The quality was grainy like it had been recorded in secret, but Greg's voice came through clear as day, using that same theatrical disappointment, that same calculated tone, telling 12-year-old Tyler that the water wasn't hot enough and he'd have to start over. Another video showed Greg timing Tyler's showers with a stopwatch, banging on the door after exactly 5 minutes. A third video had Greg going through Tyler's backpack piece by piece, examining each homework assignment for imperfections, while Tyler stood there with his head down. Tyler said he'd kept all these videos secret for 3 years, that even his mom didn't know they existed because Greg had threatened him during the custody hearings. I asked why he hadn't said something sooner if he had all this proof. His eyes got watery, and he explained that Greg told him if he ever contacted me or my mom, he'd make sure Tyler never saw his own mom again. That Greg still had partial custody rights and could make Tyler's life hell during his required visits. But when Tyler heard about the burned hand incident through kids at school, he knew I'd fought back, and maybe I'd understand. We sat there for over an hour, going through more videos, more evidence of Greg's patterns, and I took photos of everything with my own phone for backup. By the time I looked at the clock, it was past 6, and I was supposed to be home by 5:30 for dinner. I grabbed my stuff and ran to my car, but I knew it was already too late. When I walked through the front door, Greg was sitting in his recliner in the living room with my mom on the couch, both of them staring at me like I'd committed murder. Greg's voice was dangerously calm as he asked where I'd been, and I noticed he'd changed his hand bandage to a smaller one, but positioned his hand on the armrest so it was clearly visible, like a reminder of what had started all this. I said library and school project without missing a beat. Greg pulled out his phone and turned it toward me, showing a map with a little blue dot marking my location history. He said according to his tracking app I'd been in the library for 30 minutes, then sat in my car in the parking lot for an hour, and he wanted an explanation for the discrepancy. My stomach dropped as I realized he'd been tracking my phone this whole time without telling me. My mom tried to speak up, saying maybe the tracking was too much, but Greg whipped around to face her so fast she actually flinched. He said she worked nights and had no idea what I did all day, that he was trying to parent her daughter while she was absent and uninvolved. I watched my mom shrink into the couch cushions like she was trying to disappear. Later in my room, I went through my phone settings and turned off all location services, then opened my laptop to message Tyler through social media instead. I told him we needed to be careful because Greg was tracking phones. Tyler wrote back immediately that Greg had tracked his phone too during the custody situation. That's how Greg always knew exactly where Tyler was and could show up to embarrass him in front of friends. Over the next week, I started keeping a detailed record of everything in a notebook I hid inside an old textbook cover. I wrote down the exact times Greg locked the kitchen, took photos of the new padlock he'd installed, documented every rule and schedule he posted on the refrigerator. I photographed him changing his bandage every morning, like it was some kind of ritual, always making sure my mom saw it before she went to bed after her night shifts. I took pictures of the Find My Phone app on his tablet when he left it unlocked, showing how he had my phone labeled as problem child in his tracking list. The next morning at school, I found myself outside Ms. Rodriguez's office again, my notebook heavy in my backpack. She looked up when I knocked, and something in my face must have told her this wasn't a casual visit because she closed her laptop and gave me her full attention. I sat down and asked the question I'd been rehearsing all night about what would happen, hypothetically, if someone had evidence of emotional abuse. Her expression sharpened immediately, and she leaned forward, telling me that hypothetically, everyone's safety would need to be ensured first. She explained how mandated reporting worked, how custody evaluations happened, how family court operated, but then she paused and looked at me seriously. She said emotional abuse was harder to prove than physical abuse, and that documentation would be crucial. I nodded, thinking about my growing notebook and the videos Tyler had mentioned having. When I got home that afternoon, Greg was waiting in the living room with my mom, both of them sitting on the couch like they'd planned an ambush. Greg announced he'd hired a family therapist, Dr. Brennan, who came highly recommended for troubled teens. I recognized the trap immediately because Greg would control the whole narrative with a therapist he'd chosen and probably already coached. The first session was 3 days later, and it was exactly what I expected. Greg presented himself as the concerned stepfather, his bandaged hand visible on the armrest, his voice actually breaking as he described his fear of me. Dr. Brennan, a thin man with wire glasses who looked like he'd never questioned authority in his life, took notes while I sat there in furious silence. When I finally tried to speak, to explain what had really been happening, Greg interrupted with his evidence. He talked about my history of anger, my refusal to accept structure, and then he actually called it an assault with boiling water. Dr. Brennan nodded along and suggested I might benefit benefit from an intensive outpatient program for anger management 3 nights a week. After the session, my mom drove me home in complete silence, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Finally, when we pulled into the driveway, she spoke without looking at me. She said maybe the program would help, that it was just 3 nights a week, that it might teach me better coping skills. That's when I realized she was completely lost to Greg's narrative, that I was alone except for Daniel, and now Tyler. 2 weeks passed with me attending the anger management sessions, sitting in a circle with actual violent kids, while Greg played concerned parent at home. Tyler and I developed a careful system of communication through Daniel, who would pass notes and flash drives between us at school. Tyler shared more evidence with me, including emails between Greg and his mom during their divorce, where Greg admitted to being too strict, but framed it as caring too much about Tyler's future. Then everything exploded when Tyler's mom, Diane, called our house on a Thursday evening. I heard her voice through the kitchen phone, loud and angry, telling Greg that Tyler had mentioned I'd been asking him questions about their divorce. She said she didn't appreciate Greg dragging her son into his household drama, and for the first time ever, I watched Greg's mask slip right in front of my mom. His face went red, then white, and his hand gripped the phone so hard I thought it might crack. After he hung up, he turned to me with cold fury in his eyes and accused me of poisoning Tyler against him. I stood my ground for once and told him I'd never said a word against him to Tyler, that maybe Tyler just remembered what Greg had done to him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, and my mom looked between us like she was seeing something new. Without another word, Greg walked over to where I'd left my laptop on the coffee table and grabbed it. He said he was checking everything, all my emails, messages, search history, that I was conspiring against this family. My mom protested weakly, saying something about privacy, but she didn't physically intervene as Greg typed in the password he'd forced me to share months ago. Greg's tracking app calling her problem child is peak villain energy. Nothing says loving parent like literally labeling your stepkid as a problem in your phone while stalking their every move like some discount spy movie bad guy. I stood there watching my personal space get invaded, completely powerless to stop him. His fingers flew across the keyboard while I watched him scroll through months of messages with Daniel, my search history about emotional abuse, the draft emails I'd never sent to my dad in Colorado asking if I could live with him. Every click felt like another piece of my privacy being stripped away. My mom stood behind the couch, wringing her hands, but not actually doing anything to stop him. After 20 minutes of this invasion, Greg finally slammed the laptop shut and told me I was grounded from all electronics for 2 weeks. The next morning at school, I felt like a zombie walking through the halls. Daniel found me at my locker and immediately knew something was wrong from the look on my face. I told him about the laptop search and the grounding, and he got this determined expression I'd never seen before. Before I could stop him, he was already walking toward the counselor's office. Second period had just started when the classroom phone rang, and my teacher answered it, then looked directly at me and said Ms. Rodriguez needed to see me in her office. My stomach dropped as I gathered my stuff and walked down the empty hallway. Ms. Rodriguez was waiting with her door open and gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk. She closed the door and sat down with this gentle but concerned expression on her face. Your friend Daniel told me you might need help, she said quietly. I can't break confidentiality unless you tell me directly, but I'm concerned about what's happening at home. I sat there for what felt like forever. 17 years of being disbelieved weighing against the genuine worry in her eyes. Something about the way she said it, not pushing, but just waiting, made my throat tight. I started with small things, testing to see if she'd dismiss me like everyone else always had. The kitchen timer, the dishwater, the way Greg monitored every minute of my day. She didn't interrupt or look skeptical, just nodded and took notes. Then I told her about the burned hand incident, how I'd finally fought back with boiling water. Her pen stopped moving, but she didn't look shocked or judgmental. I kept going, the words pouring out faster now. 3 years of psychological games. The way he'd convinced my mom I was the problem. Tyler's videos of Greg's treatment. The daily humiliations disguised as discipline. The laptop search last night. Everything. When I finally stopped talking, my hands were shaking, and I realized I'd been crying without noticing. Mr. Rodriguez handed me a tissue box, and then said the 3 words I'd never heard from any adult before. I believe you. The relief hit me so hard, I almost fell out of the chair. She explained that she was mandated to report this to CPS, that what I described was emotional abuse, and it needed to be investigated. This will escalate things at home, she warned. Do you have somewhere safe to stay if things get bad? I thought about Daniel's offer from weeks ago, how his mom had pulled me aside at their house and said I was always welcome there. Yes, I said, if I need to. She made the call right there in front of me, speaking in calm professional terms about emotional abuse allegations and concerning patterns of control. When she hung up, she told me a worker would visit within 72 hours. That night, I went through the motions like an actress in a play. I served dinner at exactly 6:15, right in the middle of my permitted kitchen window. I sat in the living room doing homework where Greg could watch me from his recliner. I documented every single thing I did in the family calendar he'd installed on the wall, writing homework 7 to 8 p.m. and shower 8:15 p.m. in the little boxes. The performance was exhausting, but I couldn't let him suspect anything. 3 days passed in this fake normalcy before the doorbell rang at 2 p.m. on a Thursday. Greg was at work and my mom had just woken up from sleeping after her night shift. I heard her answer the door, and then her voice got sharp and confused. A woman's voice explained she was from CPS responding to a report. My mom immediately grabbed her phone, and I could hear her calling Greg, furious. Did you call CPS on us? She demanded, storming into my room. I shook my head truthfully since I hadn't made the call myself. The CPS worker, a tired-looking woman with a kind face, interviewed us separately. She asked my mom questions in the kitchen while I waited in my room. Then she came upstairs and sat on my desk chair while I sat on my bed. She took photos of the kitchen timer on the wall, the lock Greg had installed on the pantry, the family calendar with every minute accounted for. She asked me to tell my story again, and I did, showing her my documentation notebook where I'd been recording everything for months. Greg's car screeched into the driveway 45 minutes into the investigation. He came through the door with his charm turned up to maximum, apologizing for not being here when she arrived and offering coffee. The worker declined politely and asked him about the kitchen lock. Oh, that, he said with this concerned parent act. After Emily's violent incident with the boiling water, we felt we needed some safety measures. He actually pulled out his phone to show her photos of his burned hand from the emergency room visit. The worker took notes with a neutral expression, while Greg explained how I'd been acting out, how he and my mom were just trying to provide structure for a troubled teen. When it was my turn to be interviewed privately in my room, I showed the CPS worker everything. My notebook with dates and times, screenshots I'd managed to save of Tyler's videos before Greg found them, the family calendar that proved the obsessive control. She looked through it all carefully, and then said something that made my heart sink. Emotional abuse cases are complex and often difficult to prove. We'll need to investigate thoroughly, which could take several weeks or even months. I heard what she wasn't saying directly, that Greg's smooth talking and my mom's support of him would make this an uphill battle. After the worker left, Greg didn't even wait for her car to leave the driveway before exploding. You brought the government into our home, he roared, his face turning purple. Do you understand what you've done to this family? My mom was crying, looking between us like she was being torn in half. Emily, how could you? We're trying to help you and you do this? I stood up and walked to my closet, pulling out the backpack I'd secretly packed 3 nights ago. I'm staying at Daniel's tonight, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Greg moved faster than I'd ever seen him move, blocking my bedroom door with his whole body. You're not going anywhere, he said. You're going to stay here and face the consequences of what you've done. I pulled out my phone and held it up. Should I call CPS back right now? Tell them you're physically preventing me from leaving? His face went through several expressions before he stepped aside, but as I passed him, he leaned in close and said in a low voice that made my skin crawl, "This isn't over. You've declared war on this family, and I don't lose." I walked out knowing I couldn't come back tonight, maybe not for many nights. I walked 3 blocks before my hands stopped shaking enough to text Daniel that I was coming over. His mom opened the door before I could even knock, took one look at my face, and pulled me into a hug that made me start crying all over again. She didn't ask questions, just led me to their guest room and started pulling fresh sheets from the closet while Daniel grabbed my backpack from the porch where I dropped it. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom saying Greg would let me come home if I apologized, and withdrew the CPS complaint. But I hadn't even filed one, and I wasn't about to apologize for protecting myself, so I texted back exactly that, and she didn't respond for the rest of the day. School was worse than I expected because somehow everyone already knew parts of the story, twisted versions spreading through whispers in the hallways about how I'd burned my stepdad on purpose, and CPS was involved, and I was living with the Johnsons now. I kept my head down and tried to focus on classes, but at lunch, Tyler found me hiding in the library, his face pale and panicked, as he grabbed my arm and pulled me behind the biography section. He told me his dad had called his mom that morning, threatening to file for full custody, and claiming she was turning Tyler against him, all because Tyler had talked to me about what Greg did to both of us. I could see Greg's strategy now, punishing everyone who dared to support me, making them choose between helping me and protecting themselves. Ms. Rodriguez found me after school and brought me to her office where the school social worker was waiting with a folder full of forms and a serious expression. They explained they were creating a safety plan and documenting everything for the CPS investigation, which apparently someone had filed even though it wasn't me, and the social worker kept emphasizing that Tyler's evidence would be crucial, but he'd need his mother's permission to share the videos he'd taken. That night, while I was doing homework at Daniel's kitchen table, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, it was Diane's voice, Greg's ex-wife, saying Tyler had told her everything about the videos and what Greg had done to both of us. She said she was driving down from Des Moines tomorrow because it was time someone stood up to him, and for the first time in days, I felt something like hope flickering in my chest. A week later, the CPS worker came to interview Tyler at school with his mother present, and Tyler showed them all his videos while Diane provided copies of their divorce documents that cited emotional abuse as one of the factors. Something's not adding up about how fast this CPS worker showed up. Usually these reports take weeks to get investigated, but here she is in just 3 days. The way Greg switched from rage to smooth talking when the worker arrived shows he knows exactly. The case was building, but everything moved so slowly. Forms and interviews and documentation, while I tried to keep up with school but couldn't concentrate on anything. My calculus grade dropped from an A to a C, my college application sat half finished on my laptop, and I could feel Greg winning even if he lost the CPS case because he was destroying my future just by disrupting my present. 3 weeks after I'd left home, Mom showed up at Daniel's house looking like she'd aged 5 years. Her scrubs wrinkled and her eyes red-rimmed as she stood on the porch asking me to please come home. She said Greg had agreed to remove the kitchen lock and stop the tracking, that we could work things out as a family, but I could see she was breaking under the pressure of choosing between us. I told her Greg was abusing her too, that the way he talked to her and controlled her and made her doubt herself was abuse, but her face just crumbled as she insisted he was trying to help, and we were a family. Standing there watching my mother defend the man who'd made both our lives hell, I realized she might be too deep in his control for me to save her, at least not yet. 3 weeks dragged by with CPS workers showing up at random times to interview everyone separately. The supervisor finally called us all to a meeting at their office downtown. She sat behind her desk shuffling papers, while Greg sat there in his best suit looking like a concerned father. She looked up and told us they'd found concerning patterns, but nothing requiring immediate removal from the home. They were recommending family therapy with a court-appointed therapist instead of Dr. Brennan, who Greg had been seeing. Greg's jaw tightened, but he nodded like this was exactly what he wanted. That night, Daniel called me crying because Greg had phoned his parents suggesting their son might be inappropriately involved with a troubled girl. His dad had shut Greg down hard, but then sat Daniel down and asked if maybe I should find somewhere else to stay. The stress was getting to their whole family, and I could see it in the dark circles under Mrs. Johnson's eyes. Ms. Rodriguez set me up with a legal aid lawyer the next day, who explained emancipation laws while I sat in her cramped office. She said I could petition at 17, but I'd need to prove financial independence, and my $2,000 in savings from my part-time job at the mall wasn't nearly enough. Tyler texted me that night with screenshots of messages between his parents about child support. Greg was suddenly offering to reduce payments if Diane stopped interfering with his new family situation. Tyler said his mom wasn't buying it, and was actually talking to her lawyer about increasing support, since Greg had clearly lied about his income. The first therapy session happened 2 days later, in a bland office building near the courthouse. The therapist was this older woman with gray hair pulled back tight, who didn't smile when Greg tried his charm routine. She'd already reviewed everyone's statements and the CPS reports before we even walked in. She looked directly at Greg and said his need for control appeared to be the central issue affecting the family dynamic. Greg's face went completely still for just a second, before he launched into his concerned parent act, but she wasn't having it, and pulled out a folder with Tyler's name on it. She'd seen the videos Tyler had recorded during his parents' divorce, and she'd read all the court documents from that case. She told Greg this was clearly a pattern of controlling behavior that went back years. Mom's face went white as she turned to look at Greg, who was already talking fast about how he'd grown since then. He said he'd been too strict with Tyler, but that was different because I had actually assaulted him with boiling water. The therapist just wrote notes while he talked, and then asked Mom if she knew about the videos, or the accusations from Greg's first marriage. Mom's voice was barely a whisper when she said Greg had told her his ex-wife was lying and trying to poison Tyler against him. After the session, Mom confronted Greg in the parking lot while I watched from the car. She was yelling about Tyler and asking why he'd lied to her about what really happened in his divorce. Greg stayed calm and kept touching her arm while he talked, but she kept pulling away. He was saying something about protecting her from his ex's drama and how he'd changed, but Mom wasn't looking at him anymore. She got in the car without another word, and we drove home in complete silence. I went back to school full-time the next week, even though I was still staying at Daniel's house most nights. My teachers had all been briefed about my situation and offered extensions on assignments I'd missed. I threw myself into college applications during every free period because getting into a good school far away felt like my only real escape plan. My guidance counselor helped me apply for every scholarship and grant we could find since I couldn't count on any help from home. Tyler and I met at a coffee shop downtown with his mom Diane there for support. She bought us all drinks and sat across from us with tears in her eyes as she apologized for not fighting harder during her divorce. She said she should have pushed for supervised visitation when Tyler was younger, but Greg's lawyer had been better, and she'd been been too beaten down to keep fighting. Tyler actually looked hopeful for the first time since this all started, and kept showing me texts from other kids at school who'd heard about what was happening. The CPS investigation finally wrapped up after 2 months with a final meeting where they announced their findings. They'd found founded concerns about emotional abuse and family dysfunction, but no criminal charges would be filed. They mandated continued therapy for the whole family, and parenting classes specifically for Greg. They also said I could choose where to live, and Greg couldn't stop me from staying with friends if that's what I wanted. It wasn't justice, but having it on official record that there were real problems felt like validation after years of being told I was dramatic. The first family therapy session was 3 weeks later at a clinic downtown. Greg showed up, wearing his best suit and cologne so strong it made my eyes water. He sat down and immediately started talking about how this was all just a big misunderstanding between two people with different ideas about raising kids. The therapist, this older woman with glasses and a notepad, let him go on for about 5 minutes before she cut him off. She looked him straight in the eye and said, installing locks on doors and tracking a 17-year-old's phone wasn't a parenting style, but control. Greg's face went red and his jaw tightened, but he kept smiling. Mom finally spoke up for the first time in months without looking at Greg first. She said she'd been so tired from working nights that she'd trusted Greg to handle things at home, and she hadn't seen what was really happening. She turned to me and said she was sorry and that she should have listened. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but hearing her say it out loud in front of someone else made my chest feel less tight. Greg tried to argue that the therapist was being unfair and taking my side without hearing his perspective. The therapist suggested he might benefit from individual treatment to address some narcissistic patterns she was observing. That's when Greg lost it completely. He stood up so fast his chair fell backward and declared this whole thing was a witch hunt designed to make him look bad. The therapist stayed calm and wrote something on her notepad while Greg stormed out, slamming the door so hard the pictures on the wall shook. Mom and I sat there in silence for a minute before the therapist told us Greg's refusal to continue would be documented in the official report. Over the next month, things started changing fast. Greg agreed to stay with his brother across town while Mom and I tried to figure things out. Walking into our house without him, there felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater. The kitchen door he'd installed the lock on stood wide open all the time now. Mom and I started having real conversations at the kitchen table where we used to eat in silence. One night she admitted she'd been so grateful to have someone who wanted to help raise me after Dad left that she didn't see the price we were both paying. We didn't hug or cry or have some big movie moment, but we sat there together understanding each other for the first time in years. Then Greg filed for divorce and everything got ugly again. He demanded half the value of the house plus spousal support, claiming Mom's false accusations had ruined his reputation in town. His lawyer sent over a stack of papers so thick Mom's hands shook trying to read them all. That's when Diane reached out through Facebook saying she'd heard about the divorce and wanted to help. She had boxes of evidence from their marriage, including emails, where Greg admitted to enjoying making her question her own memory, and texts, where he bragged about his control tactics to his friends. She also had therapy records from their marriage counselor, who documented Greg's patterns of manipulation. The evidence kept piling up, and Greg's perfect image started cracking. Then Tyler found something that changed everything. He'd been helping his dad move some stuff from our garage when he discovered a bunch of small recording devices Greg had hidden around the house. Greg had been recording our conversations for months, trying to gather evidence to use against me, but he'd forgotten one important thing. The recordings also captured him doing exactly what we'd been saying he did. Tyler copied everything onto a flash drive before Greg even knew he'd found them. There were hours of Greg gaslighting me about the dishes, about my grades, about my friends, all while the recorder captured his calm voice, telling Mom later that I was being dramatic and making things up. Tyler playing detective and finding those hidden recorders is like Greg writing his own villain confession tape. Nothing says, I'm totally innocent, like secretly recording your stepdaughter for months while telling everyone she's making things up. The recordings had him admitting to Mom that he enjoyed watching me redo tasks, and that it was good for building character through frustration. They even caught him practicing his concerned parent voice in the mirror before confronting me about something. I got my college acceptance letter in the middle of all this chaos. State University with a partial scholarship for my essay about overcoming family challenges. It wasn't my dream school, but it was 5 hours away from Cedar Rapids, and that's all that mattered. I deferred enrollment for a semester, knowing I needed to see this through and make sure Mom would be okay. When Greg's lawyer heard the recordings, he dropped Greg as a client within 24 hours. The lawyer said he couldn't represent someone who'd provided evidence against himself, showing clear patterns of emotional abuse. Greg tried to argue the recordings were illegal, but Iowa is a one-party consent state, and since he was the one doing the recording, he'd basically documented his own manipulation perfectly. The divorce proceedings shifted completely in Mom's favor, and Greg's demands for money started looking more and more ridiculous. The judge scheduled my testimony for a Thursday morning in May, and I spent the night before going over everything with Mom's lawyer. When I walked into that courtroom, Greg was already sitting at his table, wearing his best suit and that fake, concerned expression he'd perfected over 3 years. I sat in the witness chair and started talking, keeping my voice steady while I described the dishwater game, the locked doors, the tracking apps, the way he'd isolate me from friends by finding problems with every single person I tried to hang out with. I explained how he'd wait until Mom was at work to enforce his made-up rules, how he'd gaslight me into thinking I was the problem, how he'd use Tyler as a weapon when I tried to stand up for myself. The court reporter typed everything, while Greg's face went from confident to confused, to something I'd never seen before, actual fear. His lawyer kept objecting, but the judge overruled most of them, especially when I pulled out the printed screenshots of texts where Greg admitted to making me redo chores just to teach me respect. By the time I finished, Greg wasn't smirking anymore, just staring at the table like he couldn't believe his own evidence had turned against him. That afternoon, Daniel picked me up and we drove to our spot by the Cedar River, where we'd been hanging out since middle school. We sat on the hood of his car watching the water, and he finally said what we'd both been thinking. You did it. You survived him. But I had to correct him because it wasn't just me. We did it. Tyler and his mom and you and even my mom finally. It took all of us. He nodded, and we sat there until the sun started setting, not needing to say anything else. 3 days later, I got a call from the admissions office at Iowa State, asking about a concerning report they'd received about my mental stability and violent tendencies. My stomach dropped until they mentioned the caller had identified himself as my stepfather, Greg Mitchell. I explained the situation and forwarded them the restraining order documentation, then called Ms. Rodriguez, who immediately sent the college her own documentation about Greg's abuse pattern, including the recorded evidence from the court case. The admissions officer called back within hours to confirm my acceptance stood, and they'd flagged Greg's name in their system as a harassment risk. 2 weeks later, the divorce was finalized, and Greg got exactly what he deserved. Nothing. No alimony, no share of the house, no joint assets, just his personal belongings, and a requirement to maintain distance from both me and Mom. The judge even ordered him to pay Mom's legal fees since his own recordings proved he'd been emotionally abusing both of us. Mom got to keep the house, but I could see her doing the math in her head, trying trying to figure out how to pay the mortgage on just her nurse salary. She started picking up extra shifts immediately. Greg had one more card to play though, and he played it at my graduation in June. I was walking across the stage to get my diploma when I heard the shouting from the back of the auditorium. "You destroyed our family." Security was already moving toward him, but everyone heard it. All my classmates, their parents, my teachers. I grabbed the microphone from the principal and said clearly so everyone could hear, "No, Greg, you did that yourself." The whole auditorium went silent for a second. Then someone started clapping, and soon everyone was applauding while security dragged Greg out. He got arrested for violating the restraining order and spent the weekend in jail. Tyler made his own choice about his dad that same week. Rather than deal with supervised visitation and court-mandated therapy, Greg signed away his parental rights completely. Tyler was finally free, but I could see him struggling with it, grieving not the father Greg was, but the father he'd always hoped Greg could become. Diane got him into therapy immediately, and slowly he started processing everything. July came fast, and I started packing for college. Each item I folded and placed in boxes, feeling like I was shedding old skin. Mom helped, both of us working mostly in silence, until she stopped and looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm proud of you for fighting when I couldn't." I hugged her and we both cried a little, knowing our relationship would never be quite the same, but slowly getting better. Moving day arrived in August, and Diane insisted on helping, showing up with Tyler in her SUV loaded with extra supplies she thought I might need. Tyler had been doing better in therapy, and as we carried boxes up to my third-floor dorm room, he said something that stopped me cold. "You showed me it was okay to tell the truth about him." We made promises to stay in touch, to have weekly video calls, to not let Greg's shadow follow us into our new lives. That night, alone in my dorm room for the first time, I got one last email from a new address I didn't recognize. The subject line was just my name, but I knew it was him before I even opened it. "You'll understand when you're older what you've lost." I forwarded it straight to the police for documentation, adding it to the file they were building for the restraining order violation, then blocked the address. His words didn't hurt anymore, didn't make me second-guess myself. They were just empty noise from someone who'd lost all his power. The next morning I woke up in my own space with no locked doors, no tracking apps, no one monitoring my every move or waiting to criticize how I brushed my teeth. I texted Mom a photo of my desk, all set up with my laptop and notebooks ready for classes. "I'm safe, I'm free." She texted back almost immediately. "So am I." Classes started the next week, and I walked into Introduction to Psychology carrying my new notebook and 3 different colored pens. The professor was this older woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun who started talking about family dynamics on day 1. She drew diagrams on the board showing cycles of control and manipulation that looked exactly like what I'd lived through. I took notes faster than I'd ever written anything before, filling page after page with terms like gaslighting and emotional abuse and trauma bonding. Other students were checking their phones or doodling, but I was writing down every single word because finally someone was explaining what had happened to me. Meanwhile, Mom had found a support group that met Tuesday nights at the community center near the hospital. She started going while I was away at school and texted me updates about the other women she met there. One night she sent me a long message about meeting another mom whose daughter had gone through almost the same thing with her stepfather. She said the woman cried when Mom told her about the boiling water incident. The next text just said that I wasn't alone and she was learning to see all the signs she'd missed. Tyler was doing better too, according to the photos Diane sent me every few weeks. He joined drama club and got the lead in the fall play, which would have never happened when Greg was around, making him feel small. His report card showed straight A's for the first time ever, and Diane said he actually smiled at breakfast now instead of staring at his cereal. I saved every photo in a folder on my laptop that I labeled "worth it" and looked at them whenever I wondered if burning my hand had been too much. For my English class, I had to write a personal essay about a moment that changed my life. I spent 3 nights typing and deleting and retyping the story of that November night in the kitchen. I wrote about the steam rising from the sink and Greg's hand going in and the sound he made that I'd never forget. My professor wrote comments all over the margins about powerful truth-telling and authentic voice and how this was the kind of writing that could change things. She gave me an A+ and asked if she could share it with her colleague who taught a class on family dynamics. Thanksgiving came faster than I expected, and suddenly I was driving back to Cedar in my beat-up Honda that Mom had helped me buy with the money she was saving from not having to pay Greg's gambling debts anymore. The house looked different when I pulled into the driveway because Mom had painted the front door bright blue and planted flowers along the walkway. Inside, everything had been rearranged with Greg's recliner gone, and the living room opened up with new furniture from the thrift store. The kitchen was the biggest change though, because Mom had painted it this sunny yellow color that made the whole room feel warm. We cooked Thanksgiving dinner together without any locks on the cabinets or timers or someone watching over our shoulders. Mom told me she'd heard through the legal documents that Greg had moved to Arizona and was already dating some woman with 3 teenage kids. Tyler getting the lead in the fall play after never being allowed to shine makes me wonder how many other kids are hiding their talents because someone's keeping them small. That's the kind of detail that stays with you. My stomach turned thinking about those kids dealing with what I dealt with, but Mom's lawyer said we couldn't do anything without proof of current abuse. That night, I stayed up late creating a detailed post on a website for background checks where I laid out everything Greg had done using dates and facts from the court documents. I made sure to use his full name and the cities he'd lived in, so anyone who Googled him would find it. I couldn't save those kids in Arizona, but maybe their mom would search his name and find my warning. Daniel came to visit me at college in March when the snow was finally melting, and we could walk around campus without freezing. We talked about his classes at community college and his new girlfriend and everything except Greg, until he stopped walking and looked at me. He said I seemed lighter, like I was actually 18 instead of carrying the weight of being 40. I actually laughed at that. Really laughed. Not the fake laugh I'd perfected to seem okay. We got coffee at the campus cafe, and I realized this was the first time in years I wasn't constantly checking my phone for angry texts or planning escape routes. The next semester, I signed up for the peer counseling program after seeing a flyer in the student center. The training was intense with role-playing and case studies, and learning to recognize all the warning signs of abuse. I helped other students who came in with stories that sounded so familiar, it made my chest tight. Each person I helped file a restraining order or find emergency housing, or just validated their experience, felt like taking back something Greg had stolen from me. A whole year passed before I got the Facebook message that made my hands shake. It was from a 16-year-old girl in Cedar, whose mom had started dating a guy named Greg Mitchell, who just moved back from Arizona. She'd found my post online and wanted to know if it was really true. I wrote her back immediately with links to resources and the phone number for Ms. Rodriguez, who was still working at the high school. I told her to document everything and trust her instincts and know that she wasn't crazy if something felt wrong. She messaged me back a week later saying her mom had broken up with Greg after finding my post and talking to her daughter. Now, I'm sitting in my apartment near campus getting ready for sophomore year with my social work textbook stacked on my desk. The burn scar on my hand has faded to a thin white line, but I can still see it when I look close. Sometimes, I trace it with my finger and remember that November night when I finally fought back. I'm writing the whole story down now, starting with the first line about Greg being a master at psychological warfare. He taught me something he never intended though, that even Even masters can be defeated when their victims refuse to stay victims. Time flies when you're not dodging flying objects, huh? Thanks for letting me tag along on this journey. You've been awesome company. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.